Hey guys, welcome to exercise 13, which is going to be all about the brain structures and cranial nerves. You'll find many videos on the D2L already for you on these different parts and pieces because in this lab, if we were in person, we would be doing our sheep brain dissection. So this PowerPoint is really going to give you more of a picture kind of brief overview so that you can then use that to help fill out the information on your top hat or your lab manual. But the other resources will really help you to get much more out of the brain dissection we would have been doing. So your objectives are going to be to identify the structures in the brain, including the major brain regions like the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. You're going to want to give us the general function of each of those regions of the brain, and then be able to identify cranial nerves by their name and also by their Roman numeral number that they are given. A really brief overview. If you remember from last time, we said that the nervous system is subdivided into two major divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We're really looking at parts that are in both because we're looking at the brain, which is in the central nervous system, and we're looking at the cranial nerves that start at the brain, but they actually go into the peripheral nervous system. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They're going to be named for their function or where they actually end up innervating, and they're also given a Roman numeral number. And then we also have our four major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. And we're going to really look at several models and pictures here in our PowerPoint, knowing that we would then be dissecting the sheep brain, and we have a video on that as well. So when we're talking about the brain, we're talking about the cerebral hemisphere, the cerebrum, which are the lobes of the brain, and they get their name from the bones of the cranium that are over top of them. Then we have the diencephalon, which is your epithalamus, including your pineal gland, your thalamus, and your hypothalamus. We have the brainstem, which is including your midbrain. There's a place called the tectum, which is your location that really is important for your sense of smell and sight and hearing. You've got the pons and the medulla oblongata. And then you have the cerebellum, which is sort of this like bread loaf looking structure kind of underneath and towards the back that has a lot of wrinkles on it. Here is the picture that comes from your lab manual. It's showing you your cerebrum. It has a left and right hemisphere, and there are four lobes that we can see that exist on both the left and right side. We've got the frontal lobe, which is in front where your frontal bone is. That's important for conscious thought, storing memories, motor control, and really like your personality, emotion, problem solving, and judgment. Right behind it, where your parietal bone is your parietal lobe. That is going to be in analyzing sensory information from your environment. Underneath it, sort of like where your ears are, where you have the temporal lobe, or the temporal bone is where you have the temporal lobe. That's going to get auditory stimulus. And then in the back is your occipital lobe. This is why we say that, parents or teachers have eyes in the back of their head. It's because your stimulus from your eyes is being processed in this back region, the occipital lobe region of your brain. Again, underneath it is our cerebellum, that sort of like bread loaf looking part. And then sort of in front of that, that's your midbrain and your brainstem, including the pons, and the medulla oblongata leading to your spinal cord. If we were to look at it in a model form, this is what we would see. And you can see some of these parts where cranial nerves would be going. We'll look at those later, but here's your frontal lobe, the parietal lobe. You can't see the temporal lobe really well from this angle. The back is the occipital lobe. You have your cerebellum, and you have your midbrain and brainstem. If we were to look at it on a picture of a sheep brain, like we've just dissected, we would see the cerebrum with the hemispheres here. Right underneath it is going to be that midbrain area, the diencephalon area, where we are going to see something called the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Both of these are really important for reflexes, for sensing sound, for sensing sight. And then underneath that is this cerebellum. And then you've got your medulla oblongata to your spinal cord. If we were to take a chunk of our cerebrum and sort of cut it in half, we would see that the inside part is sort of a lighter color than the outside part. The inside has white matter. And if we remember from our last lab, that white matter is composed of myelinated axons. So we're moving the charges. And then we also see that we have this gray matter, which is our unmyelinated axons. So it's more of an insulation. Again, taking a look here, we know that in our cerebrum, we've got a left and right hemisphere, and right down the middle is this longitudinal fissure. It's what divides it from the right and the left. You'd also notice that there's this tissue covering the brain. It's called the meninges. It also covers your spinal cord. And the meninges are a protective tissue layer. It's going to be made of the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Pia mater touching the brain, arachnoid matter in between, and then the dura mater, the toughest layer on the outside. And if you get meningitis, this is what becomes infected. And so that's why meningitis is so dangerous. It's an infection of this tissue around your brain and spinal cord. You'll also notice when you take off the meninges that there's this bending, folding pattern. If you look at the wrinkle itself, that bend and fold is called a gyri or a gyrus, depending on if it's plural or singular. And so then the little cavity, the little tunnel, the depression part between the gyrus is called the sulci or sulcus. Again, this big part here is your cerebrum, and this little part underneath is the cerebellum. And then we've got our spinal cord leading out of the brain into our vertebral column, and then the nerves would go out into the body. If we look at this, again, sort of a looking into from underneath the brain angle, we still have our cerebrum and our cerebellum. But now we're able to start to pick out some other structures. We'll see that this is going to be our olfactory bulb when we get to our nerves. But hanging down here is our pituitary gland. Our pituitary gland is going to be hanging down from a little stalky area called the infundibulum. So this little jelly bean kind of shaped structure is that. And of course, that is going to be an important um, organ for secreting hormones. We'd also look down here, and there's this widened structure called the pons. And the pons is going to be part of our brainstem region, and we'll see it leading down into our medulla oblongata, which will then lead down into our spinal cord. Again, a few more things to just sort of point out for you here. You've got your cerebral hemisphere. It's either the right side or the left side. In this example, that's going to be the right side or right hemisphere. The wrinkles, again, are gyrus. The depression is sulcus. In this front part is the frontal lobe. The back part, that's kind of hard to see, is the occipital lobe. This is our temporal lobe, and then the parietal lobe that you can't really see very well from this angle. If we look at our cerebellum, we see that it also has bends and folds, but it has a special name. It's called folia or folium, again, depending on if it's singular or plural. If we were to take a cross section of it here, again, we can see the frontal lobe, we can see the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. We can see our cerebellum, where we have this little hanging off, almost like a little dinner roll, and we can see our brainstem. Within this hemisphere here, there's this tissue called the corpus callosum. That is going to be how we are able to communicate between the hemispheres of the brain. If we look sort of underneath it, there's this sort of C-shaped structure that's called the fornix, and it is what is going to talk to the hippocampus, which is an area that is going to help regulate your pituitary glands down here to make oxytocin, to give you like your eating cycles when you're hungry, when you're feeling cold or hot. So that is really its main job, is to talk to your hippocampus. If we go over here, we see these little tree-like structures called arbor vitae. Arbor vitae is the white matter that is inside of our cerebellum. Then if we keep going down our cerebellum, there's this little lobe added on structure that's called the vermis. And then if we look at this enlarged section here, that's called the pons. And then down is the medulla oblongata. This pons area is going to be really important in containing reflux centers for the medulla oblongata. It is going to be what regulates respiration, and it is going to relay information to many parts of the brain. And then the medulla oblongata really is connecting the spinal cord to the brain. It also has some control over respiration, sneezing, coughing, and vomiting. And these are considered your brain stem. If we keep looking in here, we've got our thalamus. Our thalamus is actually part of our diencephalon, which is just the inside part of the brain. It is going to be really this sort of kind of eggy shaped structure, ovally shaped structure that is going to, again, secrete hormones. It is going to be a place for sensory fibers and motor fibers to relay information. It's involved in consciousness, emotions, memory, and learning. Sort of underneath it is your hypothalamus. It really gives its name as hypo, meaning below. And it is small, kind of a triangle shape to it. That is going to be regulating temperature, thirst, hunger, emotion, behavior, hormones. A lot of the autonomic nervous system, like your heart rate, is all coming from the hypothalamus. Then you have that infundibulum, which is connecting to the pituitary gland, which is a little bean or pea-shaped structure that is going to be involved in hormone production, really in connection with the thalamus and hypothalamus. If we look above the thalamus, there's this sort of empty space called a septum pellucidum, sorry. And that is going to be where cerebrospinal fluid can flow. Cerebrospinal fluid is going to be bringing nutrients and removing waste from the tissues in the brain. If we look, it's also going to end up being connected to this area called the cerebral aqueduct, which then leads into this fourth ventricle. So our hypothalamus thalamus area, that is going to be making up our diencephalon, our mid, like inside the brain, deep brain, and it makes the wall of the third. This is a typo, third ventricle, which is very important because it will go, the fluid will go out of this aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, into the spinal cord. Here's what we're talking about with those ventricles. They're just this space where we can move cerebrospinal fluid. So we've got lateral ventricles. Lateral ventricles are these cavities that go into the cerebral hemisphere, and they're really separated by that septum pellucidum. You've got your third ventricle, which is between the thalamus and hypothalamus, and the fourth ventricle, which has the cerebral aqueduct leading down into it, where you are near your cerebellum and brainstem. You've got this central canal then going into the spinal column. If we were to just make a cast of those cavities, those ventricles, this is what it would look like. This is your lateral ventricle going out into your brain hemispheres. Here's your third ventricle around your hypothalamus. Here's that aqueduct leading down into the fourth ventricle. This little opening space is called a foramen, just like it is on the bones. It's the intraventricular foramen. You can also see this little like bulgy part is called the choroid plexus. And again, down at the bottom, there's this bulgy part, also called a choroid plexus. And that, again, is just where we are moving the cerebrospinal fluid, bringing nutrients and getting rid of waste from our brain and our spinal column. If we then just take a look at our brainstem area, you can kind of call this upper part the diencephalon into our midbrain. This is going to be the most like ancient type structure. It's sometimes called your reptile brain or your fish brain. This is the part that's really involved in like respiration. It's going to be involved in reflexes. It will have your senses located like here. This is going to be what connects higher parts of the brain to the spinal cord. And it really has this midbrain area, which has these little peduncles, and then it has your superior colliculus and your inferior colliculus. And your superior colliculus is going to have functions in your hearing of sound, and the inferior is in like sight, um, and really just reflexes within your eyes, head, and the trunk of your body. If we go down a little bit to this widened spot, that's your pons. It's going to be there for respiration. And then the medulla oblongata, still a little bit of respiration, coughing, sneezing, vomiting, but its main job is to connect down into your spinal cord. Here is, again, sort of what that looks like. You've got something called the optic chiasma. This is like on the kind of flip side of this. If we turn it, you've got optic chiasma responsible for your eyesight reflexes. You've got something called a mammillary body. This is like a little button that is that part of your brain that is going to be responsible for like memory. It also is really associated with your hypothalamus. Again, this widened part is the pons, and then down to the medulla oblongata. Really, some really important parts here is knowing that your superior colliculus and inferior colliculus, that is part of what we would consider your midbrain in the underneath the diencephalon. And then the pons and the medulla oblongata are really in the brainstem area. Here's what this would all look like if we were to look at it on a sheep brain that's been dissected. You've got the cerebrum here with the gyri and the sulci. You've got this thick band, that's your corpus callosum, and there's your C-shaped kind of fornix area. You've got your thalamus and then your hypothalamus. It would then lead down into your pituitary gland. You've got your cerebellum with this branching white matter, the arbor vitae. Remembering the folds on the outside are that folia. You've got your diencephalon area here, leading into your pons and medulla oblongata of your brainstem. That being said, when you look at a brain, it's not as like clean as this. You're going to see things like your optic nerve coming out, this optic tract going back into the brain. These are going to your eye. This little area in the middle is called the optic chiasma. You've got your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. You're going to still see that little point, that mammillary body involved in memory, sort of in the middle, then the pons and the medulla oblongata and spinal cord. So there are many pictures, many videos of this dissection on the D2L for you. Please take some time to look through it, because it is hard to see these things compared to a nice picture that's nice and clean, or a model that's nice and clean. On the actual brain, it's a bit messier. All right, so let's then jump into something a little different, which is our cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are going to exit the brain, and each cranial nerve is given a name and a number. And its name is really going to tell us like what it is going to innervate, or like what it's going to do. In order to remember them in order, there's several mnemonic devices. Your book says, "Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly," to try to remind you olfactory, optic, that sort of oculomotor, trochlear, that order. It also gives you some may marry money, but my brother says bad business to marry money, which will help you to remember, is it a sensory type neuron? Is it a motor neuron? Or is it do both things? So let's go through them. This stalky bit up here, that's your olfactory bulb. Your olfactory is going to be nerve number 1. And so it is going to go to your olfactory epithelial cells, so to your nose, and it is a sensory neuron for smell. You're then going to come down to this little X shape. That's going to be your optic nerve. Optic nerve is going to your retina. It is a sensory nerve for vision. You're then going to go to nerve number 3, which is your ocular motor nerve. Your ocular motor nerve is going to be a motor neuron for your eyeball and eyelid movement, as well as constricting your pupil. Nerve number 4 is your trochlear nerve. It's this little tube. It is going to be there for sensory, for taste, and motor for facial expression, and I'm sorry, it's just motor for eyeball. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Trochlear is just motor for eyeball. Then you have nerve 5, which is the trigeminal, which is this big 3-branched nerve. That's the one that is going to be for sensation in the face and mouth and chewing. Next, a little bit further down is your abducens. This abducens is nerve number 6. It's kind of sitting on top of the pons. It is going to be a motor one for moving the eyeballs. Then you have 7, which is your facial nerve. It's going to your tongue. It's there for taste, facial expression, saliva production, and tear production. So that's this little guy. Right underneath that 2-branching facial nerve, underneath it is the vestibulocochlear nerve. That is a sensory nerve for hearing and balance. Number 9 is your glossopharyngeal nerve. That's going to be for taste as well as for swallowing and speech. Right underneath that is going to be your vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve is sort of down towards the medulla oblongata and running down along your spinal cord. The vagus nerve is going to be for general senses in your pharynx and epiglottis, so like in your throat. It's also for swallowing, coughing, speech. It directs your heart, lungs, and digestive tract. Then you've got this accessory nerve. That's number 11. That goes to your sternocleidomastoid and trapezius to move your head and shoulders. And last but not least is running right down the middle of your medulla oblongata is the hypoglossal. That is going to be for your tongue and allowing for speech and swallowing. So what are you going to do today? You are going to go through the D2L. Make sure you know the parts and pieces. You're going to go through all of the sheep dissection stuff, the labeling, all in Top Hat. And then you're going to study for the quiz on the D2L, which just covers brain parts and cranial nerves. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you have a really fun time with the lab materials and a great day.